Next day, Jody became nervous that her son had not yet returned from the party in Victor Harbor. That evening, Jody called the police and reported Fred Brooks missing. 2 days later, on September 19th, Bunting and Hayden told her that they'd seen Brooks in downtown. He was blackout drunk and acting aggressively. Jody called Brooks's mobile phone and heard the voice of Fred Brooks telling her to leave him alone. On September 21st, Mark Hayden towed the old car to his house, pulled Brooks's corpse out of the trunk, and dumped it on the floor of his garage. 3 days later, Bunting and Wagner bought a fourth black barrel, dumped Fred's body into it, and added acid, mirroring their disposal of Gardner, Lane, Porter, and Yude. On September 26th, Elizabeth Hayden received a landline call from someone impersonating Fred. She heard the voice of her nephew, Fred Brooks, verbally abusing her and saying that he had no intention of returning. After consulting with her sister and Fred mother Jody Elliott, Elizabeth Hayden called the police and told them that Fred Brooks was no longer missing. He had simply run away. The case was closed, labeled a runaway, a tragic lie that buried Fred's fate until the Snowtown Vault's discovery in 1999. John Bunting's appetite to kill had overtaken him, and his next victim proved John Bunting's killings had nothing to do with targeting pedophiles. Bunting simply enjoyed killing. Gary O'Dwyer was a man who cheated death once, only to find it waiting in a quieter, crueler form. He was 29 when his life ended in October 1998. Gary was born in Adelaide in late 1969 and abandoned by his parents. At 18 months old, he entered foster care with Maureen and Darian Fox, a couple who had already fostered 9 children. Growing up on their idyllic farm outside Adelaide with 6 foster siblings, Gary bonded closely with foster sisters Debbie and Denise. In 1974, Darian Fox died of a heart attack, but Maureen continued raising the children. She had a particular soft spot for Gary, who was always very small for his age, partly owing to severe malnutrition when he was a baby. By 1984, at 15, Gary left the farm, becoming a homeless juvenile delinquent. He survived through petty thefts and burglaries. When caught, he always confessed. He saw no point in lying. On Christmas night, 1994, Gary was struck by a hit-and-run driver while walking along a highway south of Adelaide. The 25-year-old was knocked unconscious and badly injured. The driver who hit him sped away. Gary was discovered by a truck driver the following morning. He spent a week in a coma and underwent surgery to repair his fractured skull and mangled left leg with steel plates. After 6 months of rehab, it became clear he had severe brain damage, impairing his ability to think abstractly. He walked with a permanent limp. The driver was eventually caught, criminally charged, and forced to pay a large settlement. Gary used the money to rent a home and lived on a disability pension. Gary found it difficult to relate to other people and had no friends whatsoever, but his foster mother Maureen kept in constant touch with him. Despite his challenges, he dreamed of marriage and children, but his brain damage made social connections difficult. Lonely and vulnerable, he turned to heavy drinking and drugs. Gary was overly trusting, often giving house keys to strangers who later robbed him. He should not have lived alone. His vulnerability made him an easy target. In late October 1997, John Bunting first noticed Gary limping across the street. He asked James Vlasakis, who was with him, "Who is that?" James didn't know. Over the next year, Bunting saw Gary frequently walking alone. In autumn 1998, Bunting ordered James to befriend Gary and find out if he had close relatives or received welfare payments. James visited Gary's neighbor Stephen Kim and waited outside for a chance to talk to Gary. Gary eagerly answered all James's questions. On October 26, 1998, just 5 weeks after Fred Brooks' murder, Gary's foster mother, Maureen, saw him walking down the road in Murray Bridge, carrying his groceries home. She was driving the opposite direction and couldn't stop to speak. It was the last time she saw him alive. Later that day, James Vlasakis was driving in Murray Bridge when he noticed Bunting's car behind him. He pulled over. Bunting approached Jamie's window and asked him what his plans. James replied that he was going to a party with friends. Bunting told him to put it off. He had something for him to do. Bunting ordered Jamie to lure Gary to his death. James went to Gary's house claiming friends wanted to meet him. Gary, excited for company, agreed. At 8 p.m., John Bunting, Robert Wagner showed up at Gary's house. James Vlasakis introduced them. They chatted and drank for 10-15 minutes. Bunting stayed sober. Suddenly, Wagner grabbed Gary in a headlock, choking him until he had a seizure. When Gary woke up, he begged, "What's going on?" Bunting told him to shut up and only speak when spoken to. Gary was cuffed and dragged into the kitchen. Gary was shaking from head to toe and did not attempt to resist. Gary was beaten until he falsely confessed to being gay and a child predator, neither of which was true. Gary would ultimately suffer the same torture as those endured by Fred Brooks. Beaten, whipped with a belt, and given electric shocks, they took their time and drew it out as long as they could. When Gary finally died, he was dumped in the laundry room. The next day, Bunting, Wagner, and James looted his house, wary of neighbors Steve and Kim recognizing them. In the hot Australian summer, Gary's body began rotting quickly. 3 days later, Bunting and Wagner returned, moved the corpse to Mark Hayden's garage, dismembered it, and stuffed it into the same acid-filled barrel as Fred Brooks. Gary was Bunting's 10th victim. He was chosen at random, not because he was gay or a pedophile, but for his disability payments and to feed Bunting and Wagner's sadism. Gary's foster mother, Maureen Fox, did not report him missing because she didn't want to be seen as the interfering mother, and believing he could take care of himself and would contact her in his own due time. Months later, Gary's sister Denise traveled to Sydney in an effort to find her brother, but to no avail. Elizabeth Hayden is Mark Hayden's wife and Frederick Brooks's aunt. Born Verna Elizabeth Sinclair in 1961 in South Australia, she grew up in a working-class family where life was a series of struggles. Her early years were shaped by turbulent relationships, resulting in several children from different fathers, a fact that left her seeking stability. By the mid-1990s, she was a woman in her 30s, her heart set on finding a steady shore. Her hands were often busy with clay in a ceramics group, a hobby that gave her peace by shaping raw materials into beautiful things. It was through that ceramics group, around 1995, that she met Mark Hayden, a quiet man with a shadowed past of his own. They married in 1997, settling in Smithfield Plains with Elizabeth's 2 youngest sons, aged 11 and 12. Mark's home became a refuge, but it was also a bridge to Bunting's dark world, a bridge Elizabeth didn't see clearly at first. Elizabeth's sister, Jodie Elliott, born around 1955, was close to her. Jodie, who had below-average intelligence, had a son named Frederick "Fred" Robert Brooks, later one of the Snowtown victims. In May 1998, Jodie moved to South Australia with Fred to be near Elizabeth. Mark's friendship with Bunting meant he was a frequent guest in their home. Elizabeth initially saw Bunting as harmless, just her husband's friend, unaware he targeted pedophiles, gay men, and the weak. But whispers grew, disappearances in their community, rumors about bodies, and Mark's silence when she asked questions. By October 1998, Elizabeth's unease had hardened into fear. She'd heard enough, seen enough, maybe noticing the strange flow of money from welfare checks. Bunting, sensing her as a liability, decided she knew too much. Her knowledge threatened his secrets. On November 21, 1998, a night that would end in horror for Elizabeth Hayden. Her husband, Mark Hayden, and their 2 sons had gone out for the evening, leaving her alone in their home. John Bunting and Robert Wagner seized this opportunity, arriving at her residence with deadly intent. They handcuffed her, pushed her into the bathroom, and forced her into the tub, their usual method. She was brutally beaten. Bunting turned on a tape recorder, forcing Elizabeth to say phrases they could use in fake phone calls. A sock was stuffed into her mouth and taped shut. She was tortured like earlier victims. Robert Wagner tied a noose around her neck and strangled her to death. Bunting and Wagner wrapped her body in garbage bags and dragged it to the garage. They attempted to place her into a new 5th black barrel, but struggled due to her weight. They dumped her body on the garage floor and went back to the house to rest. Later, they tried again, eventually forcing her into the barrel with the noose still around her neck and a sock taped in her mouth. On Sunday, November 22, 1998, Mark Hayden told his sister-in-law, Jodie Elliott, that Elizabeth had stumbled home drunk at dawn, packed her belongings, and fled with a new boyfriend for good. Jodie, Elizabeth's sister, bought this story. After all, Elizabeth had left husbands for other men before. Jody also reasoned that her sister probably wouldn't try to contact her because she lived in the same house as Mark. But Elizabeth's brother Gary refused to believe she'd vanished without a word, abandoning her 2 young children. He confronted Mark, demanding he file a missing person report. When Mark refused, Gary took matters into his own hands. On November 25th, he marched into the police station and filed the report himself, marking the first official crack in Bunting's meticulously constructed facade.
I knew that something was wrong on Sunday when Mark came to pick the boys up.
Gary and Sinclair last saw his sister Verna in November 1998, when he offered to babysit her 2 sons for the weekend. He says Verna and Mark's marriage had been rocky, but he never suspected anything was wrong until Mark Hayden returned to collect the boys without his wife.
Verna had never dropped them off and not been there to pick them up. It was the whole situation wasn't right. When they'd gotten home, they were sent straight to bed, and when they asked where their mother was, they were told their mother wasn't there and she wasn't coming back.
Mark Hayden, Elizabeth's husband, hadn't asked for his wife to be killed, but he knew it would happen. When he came home, he assisted Bunting and Wagner. He helped load her body into his truck. The barrel containing Elizabeth was then transported to Snowtown's disused bank vault, where it was filled with acid and stored alongside other victims' remains. John Bunting circulated a rumor that Elizabeth Hayden had abandoned her family again, like she had done several times before, recycling her past to mask his crime. David Johnson was James Vlasakis' stepbrother. Born on December 19, 1975, to Marcus and Carleen Johnson, his parents divorced in 1980. Carleen won sole custody of David, his twin brother Michael, and his older brother Nigel. In 1989, Carleen moved the boys to Hamilton, Victoria. A year later, at 15, David asked to return to Adelaide to live with his father. Carleen agreed and took him there. Marcus Johnson, surprised by this, said he needed permission from his new partner, Elizabeth Harvey, whose sons, Troy and Jamie, already lived with them. Elizabeth consented on one condition: Carleen had to pay for new furniture. David did not get along with his step-siblings, Troy Yude and Jamie Vlasakis, and mostly kept to himself. In 1992, Marcus and Elizabeth split. David and his father moved into their own flat. By 1994, Elizabeth had moved in with John Bunting, whom David feared. Bunting's erratic, violent behavior and threats to beat him up for no reason terrified David. Bunting also mocked David's neat appearance and good clothes, calling him a yuppie and faggot. David spent part of 1994 living with his mother in Hamilton, but returned to Adelaide in 1995, age 20, to live with Marcus. Troy and Jamie frequently visited the flat, sometimes staying for days. On May 7, 1999, Jamie visited David's flat, claiming a friend was selling a computer for $200. The catch: they had to drive north to collect it. David was thrilled about the price and agreed. On May 9th, they set off. Bunting instructed Jamie to enter Snowtown's disused bank through a side door where he and Wagner waited. Jamie and David Johnson arrived at the bank in Snowtown. Inside the bank, David thanked Jamie for the deal, unaware of the trap. As they entered the manager's office, David saw Bunting and a computer. David was surprised to learn that Bunting was the mate that Jamie had been talking about. Suddenly, Robert Wagner grabbed him from behind, and Bunting handcuffed him. Forced to sit on an old TV, David asked, "What the hell's going on?" Bunting lied. "You'll go home in half an hour if you cooperate." David Johnson was ordered to hand over his wallet and PIN. Bunting forced him to record phrases into a soundboard, numbers 1-100, names of 70 people, and words like yes, no, pub, to mimic his voice later. Instead of a tape recorder, Bunting used a 1990s soundboard to recreate victims' voices. This allowed him to combine new phrases instead of relying on fixed recordings. They stripped David with a Stanley knife and forced him onto a black plastic sheet spread on the floor. Bunting shoved one of David's socks into his mouth and sealed it with duct tape. They beat him brutally, leaving him bloodied and broken. Bunting sent Jamie and Wagner to test David's PIN at an ATM to confirm the number he'd given was correct. Meanwhile, Bunting paused the torture. Jamie and Wagner arrived at a petrol station and tested David's bank card by attempting to withdraw $5. The machine rejected the transaction. Jamie called Bunting and reported, "It's cancelled. He's broke." Bunting ordered them to return. Realizing he'd be killed when Wagner and Jamie returned, David sat up on the plastic sheet. He curled against the wall, slid his cuffed hands under his legs, and lunged at Bunting. Tackling him to the ground, David kicked Bunting's ribs with such force they cracked. Snatching the Stanley knife, he brandished it at Bunting, threatening him. Bunting staggered back, momentarily retreating. He shouted for Wagner's help, knowing full well Wagner and Jamie hadn't returned. Distracted, David glanced toward the bank's side door. In that split second, Bunting tackled him, slamming David to the floor. The Stanley knife clattered across the room out of reach. Bunting wrapped David's belt around his neck and strangled him, ignoring David's desperate attempts to loosen it. The force of the belt broke David's thumb before he finally died. David Johnson lay dead, face down on the floor. When Wagner and Jamie returned to the bank, Wagner peered into the manager's office, saw David's corpse, and exploded in rage. "I'm the one who's supposed to kill them." Bunting, holding his sides in what was likely considerable pain, explained that David had attacked him. The three men dismembered David's body and placed it headfirst into the barrel. Although David's body was small enough to fit into the barrel intact, Wagner declared, "This one's going to be a slice and dice." Wagner hacked off a piece of David's leg, wrapped it in a plastic glove, and later cooked and ate it with Bunting, a cannibalistic act confirmed by court testimony. David Johnson was the only victim killed in Snowtown.
David was a very good young man who had never been in trouble with the police. He was clean cut, he was well dressed and well behaved in everything he did, and he did not deserve anything like he got. These people I knew, and I actually sat down and ate with them, and to think they've eaten my son, that's an indescribable feeling.
On the evening of November 26, 1998, a missing persons report for Elizabeth Hayden was placed on the desk of Detective Greg Stone. Newly assigned to his late shift, Stone opened the file and immediately noted something odd. Elizabeth had been reported missing by her brother Gary, despite living with her husband, Mark Hayden. Why hadn't the husband filed the report? Stone's instincts flared, this reeked of foul play, and Mark Hayden immediately became a prime suspect in his wife's disappearance, not just a person of interest, but a suspect. By 11 p.m., Stone was in his car, driving to Mark's home. The detective knocked on the door, and after a brief introduction, Mark's face flickered with surprise and unease. Stone requested that both Mark and Elizabeth's sister, Jody Elliott, accompany him to the station for questioning. At the police station, Mark's story fell apart. His written statement, a page and a half riddled with spelling mistakes and grammatical errors due to his limited literacy skills, claimed Elizabeth had stormed out after a fight, declaring she'd stay with her boyfriend. He insisted Robert Wagner, John Bunting's accomplice, had witnessed the entire scene. According to Mark, Elizabeth returned drunk at 4 a.m. the following night, grabbed her things, and vanished with her lover for good. After giving statements that matched Mark Hayden's account, Jody Elliott and Mark left the police station at 12:20 a.m. Detective Greg Stone, however, couldn't shake his doubts. Mark's account was filled with inconsistencies, but one detail stood out: Robert Wagner's name. Stone knew Wagner was already tied to another disappearance. Earlier that year, in July 1998, the Missing Persons Unit had noticed something suspicious. Barry Lane, reported missing for 9 months and supposedly in Queensland, was still withdrawing welfare payments regularly from a petrol station ATM in northern Adelaide. Police installed a surveillance camera and discovered the culprit wasn't Lane. It was Wagner. By August, they'd sought a warrant to tap Wagner's phone and track his movements, but a judge rejected it, dismissing the case as low-priority welfare fraud. Now, with Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance, Wagner was linked to 2 missing persons. At 1 a.m., Stone dispatched patrol cars to Wagner's and John Bunting's homes, requesting they come in for questioning. Wagner arrived at dawn on November 27th, but Bunting stalled, promising to appear by 6 p.m. that evening. He didn't show up until November 30th, 3 days later. The statements of the 2 men matched the story given by Mark Hayden. Bunting's 3-day delay in attending his police interrogation was no accident. Desperate to avoid detection, he arranged the relocation of the acid-filled barrels from Mark Hayden's garage to a new hiding place. The problem? The barrels couldn't stay at their homes, now under police scrutiny, nor could they risk dumping them in the open. The bodies inside had not dissolved in the weak acid, leaving them horrifically preserved. After 2 days of desperate brainstorming, Bunting turned to Dennis Cordwell, a longtime friend in Holton, a remote farming community 2 hours north of Adelaide. Cordwell owned property and kept to himself, qualities Bunting needed. To secure his cooperation, Bunting spun a convincing tale. The barrels stored in Mark Hayden's garage held kangaroo carcasses illegally hunted with a fully automatic rifle. Cordwell, unaware of the gruesome truth, agreed to help relocate the barrels to his land. On November 29, 1998, at midnight, Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, and Jamie Vlasakis loaded 4 barrels into an unregistered Toyota Land Cruiser. A 5th barrel, too bulky for the Toyota, was crammed into Vlasakis' car. Wagner and Bunting drove to Holton, stashing the 4 barrels in a thicket near Cordwell's cottage. Meanwhile, Vlasakis, who had recently moved out of Bunting's house, hid the 5th barrel in the trunk of a burnt-out car in his Murray Bridge backyard. With the evidence temporarily concealed, Bunting finally appeared for questioning on November 30th, repeating the rehearsed story about Elizabeth abandoning her family. On December 1st, police obtained a warrant to search Hayden's home. Over the next 6 weeks, 3 searches revealed damning inconsistencies. The first visit revealed that Elizabeth Hayden had apparently run away with another man, but neglected to take her personal bank card. The second search revealed that she had left behind her diamond engagement ring and gold wedding band and had thrown some soiled clothes into a garbage bag. The third search revealed a large bloodstain detected via luminol in the bathroom. Mark claimed it was from a dog giving birth, but forensic swabs were taken for testing. Throughout December, the stench from the barrels hidden near Dennis and Anne Cordwell's Holton cottage became unbearable. Anne, gagging at the rot, wafting through her windows, repeatedly demanded that John Bunting move them. He dismissed her concerns, but she persisted. The smell was a ticking clock. At the same time, police tightened their focus on Mark Hayden. On January 13th, 1999, another search of his Murray Bridge home uncovered unregistered firearms and a stockpile of ammunition. Hayden was charged with a firearms offense, which carried a potential jail sentence and a hefty fine if convicted. Police also searched Hayden's garage. While they found little, detectives noted a foul odor lingering in the air, an odor they immediately recognized as rotting flesh. Scattered across the floor were maggot casings, some hatched into flies. Investigators suspected the grim truth. Elizabeth Hayden's body had been stored there before being moved. Elsewhere, police canvassed the neighborhood, and one of Mark Hayden's neighbors, Suzanne Dickinson, stated that on the night of November 29th, she and her daughter had seen a man loading something into a Toyota Land Cruiser. Officers noted that no such vehicle was registered to Hayden or found on his property. Around the same time, in early January, Dennis and Anne Cordwell moved from Holton to the sleepy rural community of Snowtown. To Anne's dismay, they brought the Land Cruiser with them, under the assumption that John Bunting would soon relocate the barrels. The Toyota sat in the Cordwell's driveway, and when the wind shifted, it carried the stench of rotting flesh into their house. Bunting scrambled to find a new storage site and eventually settled on an ideal location just down the road from the Cordwell's Snowtown home, an abandoned bank at 30 Railway Terrace. The South Australian State Bank in Snowtown had closed its doors in August 1995. 4 months later, in December, the building was sold for approximately $45,000 to Snowtown residents Andrew and Rosemary Michael. The couple believed the building's prime location made it an attractive rental for local businesses, especially since it included a kitchen that could potentially convert the space into a modest cafe. Behind the main building stood a house that had served as the bank manager's residence for decades. In 1996, a local woman rented the bank from Andrew and Rosemary, setting up a plant shop and moving into the adjacent house. However, the business folded after a year. While the woman continued renting the house, the bank itself remained vacant, its dusty vault and empty teller booths silent. By mid-January 1999, Rosemary Michael received a call from a man identifying himself as John, who claimed to be seeking storage space. The next day, John arrived with another man named Mark. Rosemary showed them the building, noting John's keen interest in the vault. He explained they needed to store valuable car parts, and after negotiations, a rental price of $60 per week was settled. Though John dominated the conversation, the lease was signed under the name Mark Ray Lawrence, Mark's birth name, a deliberate choice to avoid rental fraud while obscuring the paper trail for police. That night, under the cover of darkness, the 4 barrels inside the Land Cruiser were hauled into the bank vault. Meanwhile, John Bunting and Elizabeth Harvey organized a move from their Burden Avenue home in Murray Bridge back to Adelaide. The relocation provided the perfect cover to transport the 5th barrel, hidden among household belongings, from the burnt-out car in Murray Bridge to Snowtown. The transfer went smoothly, and with all 5 barrels now inside, the vault door creaked shut, sealing its gruesome secret. In the second week of February 1999, the Missing Persons Unit in Adelaide determined there was enough circumstantial evidence to upgrade Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance to a murder investigation. The State Police Major Crimes Branch took over the case, which soon expanded into a multi-victim inquiry. Detectives uncovered links between John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden, and the disappearances of Clinton Trezise, missing since 1992, Barry Lane, vanished in 1996, and most recently Suzanne Allen, who had disappeared from her Salisbury North home in 1996, abandoning her pets and possessions. Allen's bank account had briefly been registered to Bunting's Murray Bridge address, and Bunting claimed she'd stayed with them before leaving the state with a new boyfriend, a story that now seemed false. On February 25, 1999, detectives secured permission for wiretaps and covert surveillance of the suspects. However, budget constraints and limited manpower meant surveillance was sporadic, roughly 2 days per week, giving Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden ample time to operate unchecked. Adding to the challenges, the trio rarely visited the Snowtown bank. Bunting had given a spare key to the bank's side entrance to Dennis Cordwell, who kept watch over the site. Adelaide police were entirely unaware of the bank's existence. The wiretaps yielded little. Bunting's gang avoided discussing their activities in detail over the phone, speaking in coded terms or veiled threats. In the meantime, John Bunting was seething. Despite 7 years of murders, they didn't actually steal that much money. Split between Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, James Vlasakis, and, to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Harvey. Back in 1992, they'd overlooked Clinton Trezise's and Ray Davies's pensions entirely. In 1996, Elizabeth Harvey had briefly impersonated Suzanne Allen to siphon funds, but they abandoned the scheme when police began asking questions. Michelle Gardner's payments lasted only weeks before Centrelink halted them, alerted by her roommate that Gardner had left without a forwarding address. Thomas Trevilian's payments were immediately cut off after he was found hanging from a tree, and Elizabeth Hayden's payments were too risky to touch amid the active investigation. Only Barry Lane's steady deposits remained, funneled to Wagner, not Bunting. This left Gavin Porter, Fred Brooks, Troy Yude, and Gary O'Dwyer's welfare checks, which Bunting split with James Vlasakis, a heroin addict prone to mistakes. Bunting occasionally posed as Porter to collect his carer's pension, while James impersonated the others at Centrelink offices and banks.